So I'm going to be reading some prose, and these are stories, 2,000-year-old stories from China that I have rewritten. And they're from some very famous Taoist texts like the Zhuangzi, Laozi. And in the original text, they're only a couple paragraphs long, and so I've enlarged them quite a bit and added more narrative to them. And it isn't necessary to know anything about Taoism to enjoy these stories. But I did it as a project for people to learn about Taoism through stories is, I think, more interesting than reading a text about it. And this is the way people have always shared, right? Through stories around the fire for many thousands of years. So as I said, most of these stories are 2,000 years old. So am I okay with the mic?
Yeah.
So this first one is a story that some of you may be familiar with, even if you don't know who Zhuangzi was. It's a very famous story about Zhuangzi and the butterfly. And this is my version. And I call it To Be or Not to Be a Butterfly. Oh, and the beauty about this book is it was published by a company in England called Watkins, and they're the oldest esoteric publishing house in England, founded in the 1800s. And they had a photographer have these photographs they printed in black and silver on this glossy paper. So they really jump out at you. And those books back there are just a smaller version of this one. So like when you're reading stories to your kids, you have to show the pictures, right? Oh, I suppose. The butterfly flitted on its way, unmindful of the gentle breeze that ruffled its wings. It flew here and there, content in its own way to wander without a goal, without any needs except to be part of the breeze that blew past its wings as it flew along, unhurried, unfurled, and even. This little butterfly's life had been brief. From caterpillar to chrysalis inside its quiet and heavy cocoon, it had stayed for what seemed eons of time, quiet, patient, waiting for the moment when it could break out of its prison, unfurl its wings and fly straight up into the air. Now it did just so, flitting around in circles, occasionally meeting up with another butterfly, always mindful of predators or a strong and sudden gust of wind that could tear at its thin, translucent wings and send it hurtling down to earth. Now and again, the butterfly seemed to have glimpses of another life, another form. It seemed to be a much heavier and more ponderous life, this other one. But usually the butterfly ignored these unsettling inner sightings and just did what butterflies do, without thought, without motive, without any other goal than to be just what it was, a butterfly flying free. And as it did so, the day lengthened into night, and the butterfly headed back to the tree where it slept through the long period of darkness. It flew gently toward it and then suddenly stopped. The man lay in his bed, bewildered, bemused, lost in thought. It had seemed so real to him, this gentle butterfly life. He lay in the early morning light, listening to the sounds of the village as it slowly came to wake all about him. He heard the creaking of doors as people made their way to the outhouses. He heard the sudden squall of an infant, the bark of a dog, the clump of an ox as it trudged out to the fields, led by its sleepy master. He heard the sounds of fires being built, the tea kettles and rice pots being readied for breakfast. He lay there a long time without rising, without moving, other than the slow and deep rising and falling of his belly as he breathed his way into the day. His dream, if that is what it was, had been so vivid, so real. He had actually experienced himself as that butterfly, had felt the breeze on his wings, felt himself carried through the air as light as a seed, had thought only butterfly thoughts. Yet now, here he was, back in his human body, back in the world of cause and effect. But which was truly real and which was the dream? Himself as a butterfly or himself as a man, waiting here for his students to come and drag him out into the light of day with their incessant questions and demands? How did he know that what he was experiencing now was not the dream? That he really was that butterfly, living its simple butterfly life, unattached and a part of the great and natural world of Tao. He smiled in the darkness then. Truly, it did not matter if he was a man who had dreamt he was a butterfly or a butterfly who was now dreaming he was a man. He knew what he knew and he knew what he didn't know. That was what sustained him through his long days and nights of his human life. What he knew or experienced in his butterfly life was also there, just outside the periphery of his vision. He almost laughed out loud. Imagine if I shared this with my students, he thought. He could just see their faces. He explained to them he was not truly sure if what he experienced in his human life was any more real than what he experienced in his butterfly life. He slowly rose from his bed and, stretching out his arms above him like the slow unfolding of butterfly wings, went forth into the day. So usually that story is just a couple paragraphs. A drunk who dreamt he was a butterfly, and when he awoke, he couldn't really be sure if he was a butterfly dreaming he was a man or a man dreaming he was a butterfly. Oh, so this next one is called the Way of Wu-Wei. And Wu-Wei is one of the most powerful principles of Taoism. Wu-Wei, it means not forcing, not overdoing, not overextending, not pushing the river, basically. And it's one of the basic principles that Taoist people all over the world try to live by. And so this is a story that I wrote that was inspired actually by a Sufi story. And it's a way to really illustrate what Wu-Wei means. Oh, here's the picture. Because this is a story about an emperor. Once upon a time, in the land of the Middle Kingdom, there lived a great emperor. This mighty lord lived in a magnificent castle, surrounded by many guards, ladies in waiting, cooks, artists, philosophers, and doctors. He awoke each day to the soft caresses of one of his many wives, ate his breakfast in a wonderful garden surrounded by the morning song of his many birds, and passed his days in the company of his many admirers and flatterers. But he was not happy. He felt that he was missing out on some essential thing of life. Just what this essential thing was, he did not know, but he knew that he did not have it, and this distressed him endlessly. He filled his court with various magicians and philosophers, all of whom tried to tell him that if he would only listen to them and them alone, he would find this essential and missing ingredient of his life. But he knew that each was only trying to better his own individual situation, so did not heed their shining and flattering words. Instead, he winnowed them out one by one until there were only two groups left, the Confucians and the Taoists. So there was always this thing between the Confucians and the Taoists. The Confucians were, everyone should know their place in society and stay there, especially women on the very, very bottom. And the Taoists were about being free, about being natural, about being your real self, and they were the artists, the poets, the rebels. So the Confucians wanted to kind of put everything in smaller boxes, and the Taoists wanted to break out all the boxes. So it gives you a little better idea of the story. But he could not decide which of them had the secret and essential thing that he was lacking. The Confucians were a haughty yet wise lot. They did not flatter him in silken phrases like the other philosophers had. They told him where his character was lacking and how he only had to reinstate the old rituals and he would be fine. They told him of the mighty days of old when the emperor was truly the son of heaven and could rule in heaven's name. All he had to do was return to those days and revive the ancient ways of the old rites and rituals, and his kingdom would prosper. He would be happy and fulfilled, both as a ruler and a man. The Taoists, on the other hand, seemed an unorganized and motley crew. They never seemed to agree on anything, even among themselves, and spent their days performing strange movements like animals in the garden, like Qigong, Tai Chi, people were and their nights drinking wine, reciting poetry, and trying to seduce his ladies in waiting. But they were said to have great powers over the elements and the secret of eternal life. Of course, when he questioned them about this, they only shrugged and said, "We have but one precious secret, and one only, my lord. Well then, he would say, what is this precious thing? Ah, they would counter, we cannot describe this secret in words, great and powerful Lord. We can only show it to you. Agreed, said the emperor, and announced a contest between the Confucians and the Taoists. Whichever could show him the true secret of their power, he said, would become the supreme teachers of the land. On the appointed day, the Confucians and the Taoists were led to a great chamber deep in the heart of the castle. A great curtain was drawn down the center of the room, dividing the Taoists from the Confucians. Both groups were told they were to create a painting, a great work of art, on the wall on either side. This would be the final test of their power and knowledge. Whoever impressed the emperor the most would be awarded the prize. Another nice photo. I mean, when they decided to publish this book, they didn't tell me they were going to do it like this. I didn't know until I got the book and was just blown away. The Confucians smiled and quickly ordered all the colors that were available in the royal storerooms. They immediately went to work designing and painting a magnificent mural. The Taoists, on the other hand, ordered a great deal of wine and a few dozen soft cloths, the softest that were available. Then they went to work on opening the wine. Day after day, the Confucians labored on their huge and wondrous mural. Day after day, the Taoists ordered more wine and simply rubbed the wall with their soft cloths over and over while singing old drinking songs at the top of their lungs. Finally came the day when the emperor would view each work of art and make his decision. First, he visited the Confucian side of the room, certain he would be in for a visual treat. He had watched how assiduously the Confucians had applied their layers of colors on the wall and how they stopped often to study the ancient texts and perform slow and stately rituals before taking up their brushes again. He was not disappointed. The Confucians had created a marvel of color and form. He saw his whole city laid out before him with his own castle at the very center of the city, the golden light of the setting sun glinting off its shapely and graceful roofs. At the edge of the painting, he saw his own magnificent form astride his favorite war horse, leading his victorious troops into battle against an already vanquished enemy. A great river ran across the bottom of the painting with cunning little waves painted all over it and the curly shadows of birds suspended above it. It was truly a wondrous and amazing sight, and the emperor was at a loss as to how the Taoists could top it. This picture is a little light, kind of hard to see, like there. It's more like the shadow of the painting, of the photo, I mean. Imagine his surprise that when he crossed over to the other side of the room to view the Taoist work, only to find a completely blank wall and a lot of slightly tipsy Taoists doing their strange cloud-like movements. True, the wall was very shiny and smooth after numerous applications with the soft cloths, but there was nothing there. No paintings of his magnificence, no golden palace, no wondrous river. What is this, he thundered. You do not even try to paint a picture. Is this the way you curry my favor? Oh, but we have done our best, cried the Taoist indignantly and a little rudely. But there's nothing there, said the emperor. Is this truly how you view me? Is this your precious secret? Wait one moment, please, said the oldest and tipsiest of the Taoists, his long beard still damp with wine. Please draw aside the curtain between our walls, and you will then truly see our work. So, shaking his head in wonder, the emperor had the curtain drawn, revealing the dazzling painting of the Confucians. The emperor stood before it once again, marveling at its wonder and how they seemed to get his noble brow just so. Then, his mind already made up as to who was the winner this day, he turned once again to the Taoist blank wall, only to find there, not a blank wall after all, but the reflection of the painting on the opposite wall. Only this time, instead of a flat and static picture, he saw reflected in the unbelievably smooth and shiny wall a moving picture. Somehow, because of the play of light on the shiny surface there, it seemed as though the painting had come alive. There was the palace in the town again, only he thought he could detect movement behind its windows. The river itself moved, the waves lapping against each other and the birds pirouetting overhead. And lastly, he could see himself there, astride his great stallion, whose very nostrils seemed to quiver in the air, while his own beard fluttered in the breeze and his lips seemed to move with his own shouted orders to his troops. He was amazed. He was astounded. He turned to the tipsy Taoists and asked them with humility and wonder in his voice just how they had managed this miracle. It is actually in not doing that we have achieved this wondrous thing, sire. All we did was create the space for the painting to happen and let it paint itself. Is this then your precious secret? Asked the great lord. Yes, answered the Taoist, it is indeed. We call it wu wei, or not doing. And it is in creative and natural not doing that we are able to achieve the highest level possible. Then they turned and bowed in unison to the dumbfounded Confucians. We congratulate you, noble sirs, in your great work of art. We watched you every day work so diligently while we drank wine and rubbed the blank wall. What you have created is truly marvelous, but with your industry, you have only created a flat and lifeless thing, while we, in our formlessness, have created a living world. It was said that afterwards, for the length of his reign, the emperor gave the Taoists in his kingdom his royal ear, and they taught him many things until the day came for him to ascend to the heavens on the back of a dragon to take his place in the realm of the immortals. So, yeah, I could stand up here and say, okay, well, wu wei means this and that, and this is what you do, and you do this and that, but to me, I think the story says it better than anything I could just list. Yeah, isn't these amazing photographs, aren't they? That one, I think is in the next story. Oh. So this next one is called Down by the River. It's not just a Neil Young song, it's also a Taoist story. And this one also has the theme of probably not wise to eat a lot of cheese and crackers before you're speaking in public. This idea that a lot of Taoist sages, sometimes they became famous as sages, and then the emperor or some of the local lords would invite them to come to their castle there, and they would kind of show them off, and they would pit different philosophers against each other. And the real Taoists, the real sages, didn't want to have anything to do with that. And this is a story from Zhuangzi. And Zhuangzi was one of those guys that really just wanted to be free and didn't want to be even taken to the palace where he could live the good life. He would rather, well, you'll see in the story what he would rather. And there's a part in the story where they refer to, in ancient China, they used to do this divination process where they take a tortoise shell and then they would heat up iron rods in the fire and then burn the tortoise shell, and it would crack in certain ways. And then there were people whose job it was to read the cracks. And that's how they told the fortune, the divination for how the year was going to be, how the crops were going to be, whether there's going to be a war or things like that. They would use tortoise shells and also ox shoulder bones. But in this story, they talk about the tortoise shells. Oh, it's a good photo too. So those little books up there are the same thing as this. I mean, they're not. They also came out with an even smaller version. The old man sat on the muddy bank of the great river, fishing quietly and watching the water flow. He liked it here, out with the sun and the mosquitoes, his toes squishing delightfully in the mud, his bottom getting wet with the early morning dew. He didn't mind a little dampness. He just liked sitting by the river and watching the water flow by. His line trailed out into the water, though he used no bait. Catching a fish was not important. The simple act of sitting by the river, toes in the mud, line dancing over the water, was enough for him. Here's another little one. The old man had been a philosopher and student of the way for quite some time. He knew he was not popular with certain segments of society, those pedantic logicians and the like who use words as a screen to hide behind or else brandish them like weapons. His teaching had always been a bit convoluted and full of riddles, puns, and a sublime sense of the ridiculous. As for arguments with other scholars and philosophers, he just wasn't interested. He often said that if two people argue and one wins and the other loses, does that mean that one is right and the other wrong? Or are they both partly right and partly wrong? Or are both all right and also all wrong? Waiting for final answers is like waiting for nothing, he told his students. Look at everything in relation to the great Tao and leave differing viewpoints as they are. That's the way to live out one's life in peace and harmony. He knew he was often laughed at behind his back and sometimes to his face. So what? He didn't care. He knew what he knew, and he also knew what he didn't know, and that was enough for him. Still, his fame had spread lately, and he was continually being bothered by people seeking the ultimate truth, as if such a thing could ever be conceptualized and put into plain words. Besides, it wasn't up to him to tell people the ultimate truth. He could only share his truth, and even that changed from day to day, just like the ongoing cycles of the seasons. No, he was better off here by the river, alone except for the mosquitoes and an occasional bird. He loved looking at the river and was thinking about the great unfolding wave and his place in it. He had learned a lot just by sitting here and watching the water flow by. He noticed that many people's energy flow was like water, just little trickles like a small creek, clogged and muddied like a dammed up stream, wild and turbulent like a river in the spring, serenely flowing like the great river in front of him, fast and furious like the rapids upriver, then growing sluggish and heavy like the part of the river that flowed past the village downstream. The trick was to find a rhythm that suited oneself and try to stick to that. It was far better to be harmonious and consistent than it was to change one's flow every other day or even many times a day. He himself had been quite turbulent in his youth, but a combination of self-cultivation and suffering had changed that. Now he just liked to sit here, toes squishing, line dancing, mind empty, bottom soaking, and enjoy the day. Suddenly he heard a commotion behind him. Two men were sliding down the muddy bank toward him. They wore the insignia of the messengers for the local lord who lived on the other side of the river in a great castle. The old man had never seen this great lord since he did not meaning the Lord, did not condescend to travel among the common people. Years ago, the old man had lived in the capital and had known many such men. They were mostly a very boring and irritating crowd, their energy stuck in their feet. They were the reason he had left the capital long ago and retired to the small village by the river. We get some birds. Last fall I was in China and we were up in the mountains and there were black swans, which I had never seen before, swimming around in this little lake. The two messengers who wore costly robes of silk were struggling to hold up their hems to avoid getting them muddied. They were out of breath by the time they reached the old man, who sat with his back to them. "Honored sir," they panted, "are you the one they call?" They used an honorific title he had been given years ago at the capital in recognition of his sagehood. He thought at first of denying it, but realized they already knew who he was when they first climbed down the riverbank. They were only using a formality. He knew it all so well, the empty, flowery phrases that fell from their tongues like rancid butter. Sighing, he got up slowly and turned to face them. "Yes," he answered, "I am that most unworthy person." He knew how to play the game. The two silken messengers looked at each other. Could this really be the great sage that their lord had sent them after? Why, he looked like a ragged fisherman. Yet there was something about his direct and piercing gaze that held them for a moment, like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. Then, just as suddenly, he was gone again, and the old man stood before them, idly picking his nose. "We have been sent by the great lord of this province to bid you come to his castle, so he may humbly prostrate himself before you and beg of you to share some small part of your great wisdom with his lowly household." What rubbish! The old man knew just what would happen if he allowed himself to be led to the castle. Hours and hours of fawning and false modesty, to be followed by days and days of being a virtual prisoner, arguing with a dim-witted nobleman who had never had an original thought in his head. He would have to deal with whatever other sages the noble had ensconced there to argue philosophy before him. All his life he had dealt with those high-minded, long-winded Confucians who confuse propriety and wisdom, duty and Tao, classism and true spiritual freedom. He wanted no more to do with them. And the logicians were even worse. How they loved to confuse and conspire with endless torrents of words, words with no spirit or real energy behind them, words which clouded one's thoughts and induced a narcotic, hypnotic effect that numbed the mind to the true reality of the way. How many endless hours had he already spent trying to get them to let go of their precious concepts and opinions and open themselves to the simple, unadorned truth of the integral and eternal way. No, he could not stomach any more of that. He had to find a way to turn them away without incurring the wrath of their great Lord. Suddenly, an idea came to him. You have the shell of a ritual tortoise at the castle, do you not? The two messengers did not know what to say. This old man was a little abrupt. They had expected him to jump at the chance to be set up in the castle. After all, he would be paid well for his efforts, and he would be wearing much finer clothing than the old rags he presently wore, and be enveloped in much richer surroundings than this mosquito-infested muddy riverbank. Yes, answered one of them finally, we do have a great and ancient tortoise shell, which, as you most assuredly know, great sage, is used for divination at certain times of the year. The old man could imagine the pomp and circumstance of the divination ceremony. The ancient tortoise shell would be carried into the hall of divination between rows and rows of seated nobles and servants, all stiff and formal. The procession would be accompanied by the ancient sing-song music of the Confucians, more irritating and less musical than the whining of the mosquitoes in his ear. Endless speeches and formal testimonials would follow. At last would come the ceremonial heating of the tortoise shell. The cracks that appeared on it could then be read. Would the year in question be good or bad for the great lord and his spike? The priests were not fools. They were not stupid enough to share bad tidings, even if they read them on the tortoise shell. The great lord would not want to know about the floods, the many farmers going hungry, the diseases and pestilence that would be visited upon the common people that year. No, he would want to hear how beneficent and wise he was, what a great ruler of men he was, what a generous and compassionate father to his people he was. The very thought of it made the old man want to vomit right there at the silken feet of the great Lord's messengers. Here we have the river, Junxus River, like the rivers we have here in Eugene. Well, he said, what do you fellows think? I can see you're intelligent men. If the tortoise himself had been given the choice between being slaughtered for his shell to be venerated for hundreds of years, or to be left alone to drag his tail in the mud, what do you think the tortoise would have wanted? The two messengers looked at each other again. Was this some kind of test? They had been told the old man was a bit odd. Some even thought him crazy. They both decided to take their time in answering, just in case. Finally, one of them took a deep breath and spoke. I suppose, he said slowly, that if it were truly up to the tortoise, why, of course he would rather have been left to, as you say, drag his tail through the mud. Then that is precisely what I intend to do with mine, said the old man, and abruptly turned his back on them, his muddy bottom winking obscenely. He gathered up his fishing line and trudged down the bank, singing an old folk song at the top of his lungs. The messengers watched him for some time as he walked slowly away. What would they say to the great Lord? They were not even sure themselves what had just happened. To think they had walked all this way and gotten muddy and mosquito-bitten for this. It was true, they would tell their Lord. The old man was crazy, not a sage, not a wise man, just a crazy old man sitting on his bottom in the mud.